In 1952, you had citizens of Pueblo and their children who were saying, what are we going to name this brand new school? There's a brand new elementary school in town, and what are we going to name it after? Who are we going to name it after? And a lot of the students says, why not name it for Old Spanny? For Old Spanny, some of them called him George or Pop, and it was George Spann. George Spann is who Spann Elementary School was named after. And this is the 1950s. This is a newspaper from the 1950s. And they pointed out that Risley was named after a retired school superintendent. There was Washington, Jefferson, Lincoln schools, Franklin schools, so they were named after famous people usually. But Risley was named after a school superintendent, a retired school superintendent. That's who Risley was. Who is Spann? Spann was a working class Joe. He was the janitor. He was everybody's friend. So a lot of the children of Pueblo City in the 1950s were sitting there talking about how good old George Spann, old Pop, old Spanny would fix their skates and their bicycles. And they also recalled that a teacher once said George fixes teachers' dispositions too. So that means he tells these asshole teachers to knock it the fuck off when they're being too power hungry and too mean to the kids. So George Spann was an advocate for students. Later on, when the kids had been asked why they chose George Spann, they said that even though it's not his job to make everybody happy, he does it anyways. There's a news report about the vacant school buildings in Pueblo City, and apparently Spann Elementary, Hellbeck Elementary, Summer Lid Elementary, and Keating Education Center. In 2014, this is also when there were no air conditioners in any of the schools, which is re-fucking-diculous. Spann Elementary, Hellbeck Elementary, and Summer Lid Elementary are all elementary schools that are vacant. And the article was talking about what are we going to do with these vacant buildings. Now, something interesting, Spann Elementary School closed in 2013 under the Lopez Administration. Maggie Lopez was the superintendent of Pueblo City Schools from 2010 to 2014. And Spann Elementary School closed in 2013. So Spann Elementary School closed underneath Maggie Lopez's watch. I'm not for sure who's to be blamed for Hellbeck Elementary School and Summerlid Elementary School, or for the Keating Education Center being closed. I don't know who you would blame for them being closed. Re-fucking-diculous. In 1954, we were building brand new schools, and now we're closing elementary schools. I hope it's not just a rearranging the deck chairs on the Titanic kind of thing, instead of just revamping and changing the curriculum or the strategy, the philosophy of school. I wonder what the philosophy of education. What is each one of the candidates for school board? What is their philosophy of education? So Spann Elementary School was closed in 2013. Spann Elementary School was named after George Spann. And this is remarkable because George Spann was a custodian. He's a janitor. So the history of this building is lost and gone forever. So it's named after a janitor, which is the only school. What other school do you know was ever named after a janitor? These people in the Deep South are honoring people who, Confederates in the 1860s. And here, Spann Elementary School was named after George Spann in the 1950s. So the 1950s was building schools. That's when Spann Elementary School was built. And it says here on kmitch.com, but the work and caring of George Spann allowed that unlikely event to take place in Pueblo in March 1953. A large crowd gathered at the new Spann Elementary on March 26, 1953. The auditorium was filled with neighbors, old friends, teachers, and pupils who knew Spann as a worker and friend during his 34 years in the school system. The chieftain the next day called Spann a happy man with an infectious smile who fixed bicycles, umpired baseball games, repaired skates, and took children to their homes after school during his 28 years as a janitor at Risley Junior High. So he was a janitor at Risley Junior High for 28 years, and this janitor was so well respected in the community of Pueblo City. How amazing! Pueblo City in the 1950s was respecting their janitors by naming a building after them. So the ceremony apparently was in March 1953, but Spann Elementary opened September 1952. And it was named for a man who had affected generations of school children and teachers. Even though he was never a teacher or administrator for himself, the paper said it was the first time he could find that a school was ever named for a custodian. So Pueblo Chieftain didn't know if there's any other schools out there. So that's a big kick in George Spann's nuts, right? So the Lopez administration basically kicks George Spann's legacy in the nuts, and now we're not respecting working class people, we're not respecting labor, we're not respecting the people that actually keep the world running. Without working people, I mean, who's going to run the world? Then that also means when working people stop, the whole damn thing stops. General strike. Some statistics for Spann Elementary when it was up and running. 89% of those who went to Spann Elementary were eligible for free lunch. So no wonder Spann Elementary got cut. No wonder they closed Spann Elementary, because everybody was poor there, right? So the poor, they don't want the poor to have education, the powers that be. And then 83% were Hispanic. So, right, poor Hispanic kids, cut their education out from underneath them. Spann Elementary taught preschool, kindergarten, all the way up to 5th grade. So that's, what, 6 or 7 grades? 6 or 7 grades gone. 255 students had to find some other place to go to school. There was this experiment, hole in the wall is what Sugata Mitra, he's an educational theorist, so Sugata Mitra, he put this computer in a wall out in Pakistan. I want to say it's Pakistan, somewhere in the Far East. So he puts, in a poor neighborhood, he puts a computer inside a wall off to the side of the town. And I don't know if they were noticing him install it and then they paid attention to it, but that's all he did. He put a computer in a wall, and then he posted a surveillance camera up somewhere and then just videotaped the computer all day long. So it was ignored at first, but then eventually a dropout, a Huckleberry Finn kind of person playing hooky from school, goes out and he starts fiddling with it and starts playing with it, and then he realizes that, it's a computer. One thing leads to the next. Now the neighborhood children are all paying attention, watching what he's doing, and they're sitting there playing like these stupid, like dumb games that teachers could never get these kids to do, but learning math games and English games, and within just a few days, just within a few weeks, a lot of these poor ghetto dropout students, these students that weren't even going to school in the middle of Pakistan, in some rural backwards community in Pakistan, these kids were going up to this computer and they understood email. They had, they all had email accounts. They understood enough English to be able to start up their own email accounts and social media, and they could do Google searches, and they could really, explore the web pretty well. So they were successful. So what? Who gives a shit, right? What does all this mean? Well, what it means is that education is self-emergent. It's self-emergent. You get people, you get one computer in the room, and then you get people around it, and you're going to have the same basic questions that we all have to ask, right? Finite resources. There's only one computer, so everybody would have to take a turn. And then now we're building, a civil society. And the finite resources, let's get everybody a bunch of laptops. So education is self-organizing and self-emergent. The only way that you can stop education is if you get a dictator who says, hey, Jimmy, get off that damn computer. Hey, Billy, quit talking to Jimmy. Hey, you two, knock it off. Y'all break it up. And listen to me go on and on about grammar. The only way education is stopped is by putting a Nazi, an oppressor, saying, go do this, go do that. So let's assume that that's the case, right? You have a computer, you got, not just one computer. Let's say you have 30 computers and you got 30 students. So 30 computers and 30 students, essentially education is self-emergent and self-organizing. Your responsibility as the adult supervisor for these 30 kids is to make sure they're not fighting and damaging property, but to be a guide by their side. They can learn and they can study whatever they want to study. They can socialize and they can talk amongst each other and then create, their own brand new world. So education isn't hard. Education is actually quite simple. If you throw a Nazi into the mix and some fascist asshole that says, I'm the boss, all you all are nobodies, right? Which is what strong mayor is. Let's get one tyrant. Let's get one despot to rule over the city, not the county, because there's two different governments, so we're going to have despotism and tyranny here in the city, but in the county, it's, who knows, right? They do whatever the hell they want to do out there. Why would somebody ever vote for that? I mean, why would you say, yes, I want that person over there to have all the power over all of us? I want all of us peasants to have no power, and I want that person over there to have all the power. That's a pretty large gamble. So the only thing that can stop education from happening from the Sugata hole-in-the-wall experiment, Sugata Mitra's hole-in-the-wall experiment, education is self-emergent and self-organizing. And since it's self-emergent and self-organizing, a fascist Nazi piece of shit can only stop education from happening. So as the supervisor in that room of 30 kids with 30 different computers, just make sure they're not beating each other up and fighting. And if they're talking and it's productive and they're making Wikipedia pages and they're making badass memes and videos and YouTube and Facebook and they're exploring this this internet age, this information age, this postmodern society. Taylor Voss is absolutely right when he says that we need to teach the kids how to think, not what to think. And so how to think, well, if you have a problem, then you need to solve that problem. And then here's problem-solving skills. Go through the steps. So if you wanted the Spann Elementary school to be a successful school, all you need to do is fill it up with a bunch of computers and then let the kids use them. Let the kids go in there and just use them and have some sort of supervisor to make sure they're not damaging property. Then education would happen. It would just happen. You don't need the teachers and the administrators. Just have computers, have it's like St. John's College. St. John's College, they only had mentors. So then they didn't have, the traditional teacher, the traditional sage on the stage, right? Look at Almighty God who has all the answers, and we stupid plebes, we dumb students have to sit here and listen to Almighty God and do as Almighty God orders and commands us to do. If you wanted Spann Elementary to be a success, you should have put computers in there, you should have put students in there, and you should have got one sensible, common sense adult who doesn't want to oppress the shit out of everybody. Somebody who can check. Everybody has a will to power. Everybody has a will to power. Why should we let you run everything? Who the fuck are you? So there was some talk about using these public buildings for something else, but unfortunately there was a bunch of damage. There was some students that went into the Spann Elementary School, and this is December 24th, 2014, so, right before Christmas time, and they apparently broke a whole, $44,000 in damage. The vandalism happened in November. This was reported in December, so they didn't even know about it after a month later. 4 males, 1 female were captured on the surveillance camera. 1 was an adult, 2 of them were minors, and 3 of the 5 got caught, but 2 of them were at large, including the girl. The girl got away with it. So Spann Elementary, 2300 East 10th Street. 4 juveniles and 1 adult broke windows. They shattered mirrors. They damaged sinks, toilets, blackboards, and video cameras. The police say the suspect left holes in walls, wrote graffiti, sprayed fire extinguishers inside the building. The damage amounts to at least $44,000. District 60 Schools said that there have been other incidents of vandalism at the Spann Elementary School in the 2 years since the school had shut its doors. But in November 2014, this was the worst.